Columns of men stretched for miles, trudging along cratered roads. Helmets hung loose, rifles were slung upside down, or discarded in ditches. The war was finished. In bombed-out villages, women watched silently as streams of German soldiers filed past toward American lines. For the prisoners, surrender meant survival, but it also meant stepping into the unknown. The collapse of the Reich had been sudden, brutal. Hitler was dead in Berlin. Cities were ash heaps. Rail lines twisted like broken ribs across the countryside. What remained of the Wehrmacht had dissolved into bands of weary men, some still in formation, others wandering alone. When the Americans ordered them to gather in assembly points, they obeyed, moving with the slowness of men who had nothing left to resist. Prisoners expected vengeance. Years of propaganda had warned them that the Allies would slaughter or starve them. Rumors spread quickly that they would be shipped to Siberia or paraded before cheering crowds. In their imaginations, surrender was only the beginning of another kind of torment. Yet when the columns reached the American checkpoints, what they found was startlingly different. Guards searched them methodically. Weapons were stacked in piles taller than a man. Watches, knives, and binoculars were taken. But there were no beatings, no executions. Instead, the prisoners were directed into fields surrounded by barbed wire, where food and water awaited. According to one American field report, some officers refused to believe it. They kept waiting for the trick. Certain cruelty would follow. But none came. They looked at us as if wondering why we hadn't struck them, wrote a U.S. sergeant. They didn't know how to process mercy. Inside the enclosures, the scale of defeat became visible. Thousands of men crowded into open pastures, their uniforms threadbare, their faces lined with exhaustion. Many carried lice and dysentery. They sat in silence, the only sounds the shuffle of boots and the distant rumble of Allied trucks. For the first time, they were not soldiers of the Reich. They were prisoners of war. Many hooks of disbelief emerged quickly. Some German officers, accustomed to harsh treatment of their own captives, could not fathom being allowed to drink clean water or receive medical attention. A diary found later in one camp read, "We expected hatred. Instead, they gave us bread." The shock deepened as days passed. American soldiers treated surrender as procedure, not revenge. Processing lines, identification papers, and registration replaced fear of execution. Though food was limited and conditions harsh, the basic order defied the nightmare German propaganda had promised. Still, uncertainty hung over the wire. Where would they be sent? How long would captivity last? Some men clutched hidden keepsakes, photographs, trinkets, unsure if they would be taken away. Others stared blankly at the sky, too numb to imagine a future. The war had reduced them to silence, and captivity sealed it. As night fell over the ruined valley, the camps glowed under floodlights strung along the wire. Beyond the fences, Germany lay in ashes. Inside, men lay on bare ground, listening to the hum of American generators and the creak of boots on gravel. For the prisoners, surrender had spared their lives. But as they drifted into uneasy sleep, one thought lingered. What awaited them behind barbed wire might test them more than the battlefield ever had. The fields once planted with wheat were now fenced with barbed wire. Wooden posts stood in long rows, the sharp wire catching the morning light. Thousands of German prisoners crowded inside, their boots sinking into the damp soil. The war was over, but their new lives as captives had only begun. American trucks rumbled past the gates, leaving dust hanging in the air. Guards patrolled the perimeter, rifles slung but ready. Inside, men shuffled into lines for roll call. They stood under the watchful eyes of their captors, silent but restless. The sound of boots on gravel, the crackle of radios, and the bark of orders in English replaced the noise of battle. At first, many prisoners feared the camps would mirror the brutality they themselves had overseen. Rumors whispered through the wire, of shootings, of starvation, of chains. But the reality was more complicated. The camps were strict, but not lawless. Each day was regimented with roll calls, ration lines, and orders shouted across the yard. Food was scarce. often nothing more than thin soup, bread, and watery coffee. Men fought off hunger by chewing on grass or trading scraps. Yet, as one prisoner later recalled in a letter home, we did not starve. We were given enough to live, though never enough to feel full. The Americans rationed carefully, determined to follow rules even with shortages. The camps were not free of misery. Disease spread quickly in the crowded enclosures. Lice tormented the men. Latrines overflowed. Nights were cold, and prisoners lay shoulder to shoulder on bare ground. Still, the guards enforced order, and order itself became a strange kind of relief. Then came the small surprises. Soap was issued, water troughs were filled, and prisoners were ordered to bathe. At first, disbelief swept through the wire. For soldiers who had marched through mud and slept in trenches, daily washing seemed like a luxury. According to one account, a guard simply pointed and said, "Clean yourselves. Tomorrow again." The prisoners obeyed, stunned. For the Americans, hygiene was routine, disease control a matter of regulation. But for the Germans, it carried weight far beyond sanitation. Cleanliness meant dignity. To scrub away grime was to remember there was still life beyond the wire. One officer wrote, "I looked down at my hands after washing. For the first time in years, they seemed like my own." The effect rippled quietly. Men began trimming hair with makeshift scissors, polishing boots with scraps of cloth, restoring fragments of their old selves. In the midst of defeat, these gestures of discipline reminded them they were still human beings. Eyewitness reports describe an odd calm settling into the camps after these routines began. The fear of immediate revenge faded, replaced by monotony. Yet the monotony carried an unexpected gift: time. Time to think, to remember, to face what had been lost. By late summer, the fields of Andernach were no longer just cages. They were places of uneasy reflection, where men lived in the shadow of defeat, but also under a strange, unfamiliar order. And as night fell, when the floodlights buzzed to life and shadows stretched across the barbed wire, the prisoners lay awake on the hard earth. Their stomachs were empty, their futures uncertain. Yet their skin was clean, and that fact unsettled them more than the hunger. For in the quiet of the camp, one question lingered. Why would the enemy allow them this small mercy? The sun beat down on the wire, turning the open fields into stifling ovens. German prisoners stood in line, their uniforms stiff with sweat, their skin gray with weeks of grime. The stench of unwashed bodies clung to the air, heavy and sour. Many had not bathed properly since the collapse of their units in April. Then came the order that none expected. American guards moved down the rows, dropping small bars into the prisoners' hands. Soap. Some men turned the pale blocks over in disbelief, as though they were stones or chalk. Others sniffed them cautiously, expecting a trick. The guards motioned toward a row of water troughs. "Washington. All of you. Every day." The first few stepped forward hesitantly. They stripped off coats, shirts, boots stiff with mud. Splashing water echoed across the compound. Prisoners scrubbed at their faces, rubbed soap across their arms, and watched as brown rivulets streamed down into the dirt. Eyewitness accounts describe laughter breaking out, raw, sudden, almost childlike. For men who had lived through years of trenches, marches, and firestorms, the simple act of bathing was surreal. A German officer later wrote, "I did not know whether to be insulted or grateful." Soap given to the defeated. Was this kindness or humiliation? His words captured the unease. To men trained to expect cruelty, the order to clean themselves was not only strange, it was disarming. The Americans had practical reasons. Disease spread quickly in the crowded camps. Lice and dysentery could kill as surely as bullets. Soap was policy, part of Geneva Convention rules for hygiene. But for the prisoners, it became something more. To wash away sweat and filth was to be reminded they were still human. Many hooks appeared in diaries and testimonies. One soldier described staring at his own reflection in a puddle after scrubbing. "For the first time since Stalingrad, I recognized the man looking back." Another recalled the smell of soap as clean, sharp, like a world that no longer belonged to us. These were not grand gestures, but they pierced through layers of fear and propaganda. Routine soon followed. Each morning, groups were marched to the troughs. Soap was handed out, and men washed under the watch of American guards. Some joked that they were being treated like schoolboys. Others whispered about hypocrisy. How could the same enemy who bombed Dresden now insist they bathe like civilized men? Yet none refused. What shocked them most was consistency. It was not a one-time act of mercy, but a rule. Even when food ran low and conditions were harsh, the soap remained. Every day, the Americans demanded cleanliness. The prisoners began to comply without hesitation, some even lining up eagerly. For the guards, it was routine. For the captives, it became a ritual. Clean faces and scrubbed hands softened the weight of defeat, if only for moments. Men trimmed hair, mended clothes, and restored fragments of identity long buried under the Reich's collapse. At night, after lights flickered on above the wire, prisoners lay on the ground smelling faintly of soap. The scent was unfamiliar, unsettling, a reminder of order in a world reduced to chaos. According to one testimony, it clung to us longer than hunger. And so the memory of those pale bars endured. Not weapons, not rations, but soap, ordinary, unremarkable, yet powerful enough to leave men questioning what captivity truly meant. As the floodlights hummed and shadows stretched across the camp, one question remained in every heart. Was this small mercy a gift or a judgment? Rain fell in steady sheets, turning the camp fields into mud. Prisoners huddled under thin blankets, their uniforms soaked through, their boots caked heavy with dirt. Along the perimeter, American guards moved briskly, their ponchos snapping in the wind. Inside the wire, the rules of captivity unfolded with relentless order. Each morning began with roll calls, names shouted against the din of rain or heat. Rations followed bread, soup, and coffee, measured and logged. Then came inspections, hygiene checks, latrine duties, and mandatory trips to the wash troughs. To the German prisoners, many of whom had watched captured soldiers treated as expendable in their own camps, the precision was bewildering. The reason lay not in sentiment, but in law. The Geneva Convention of 1929 demanded that prisoners of war be housed, fed, and kept in conditions that preserved life and health. American commanders, determined to show discipline, enforced these rules even in the ruins of Germany. Hygiene was mandatory, not optional. Soap was rationed like ammunition. Mini hooks surfaced in reports from the time. According to an American field manual, guards were instructed, disease is the enemy's ally. Cleanliness is not mercy. It is strategy. For the prisoners, however, the act felt like something else. To be handed soap, to be ordered to wash daily, carried echoes of dignity they had not expected. The contrast to German and Soviet-run camps was stark. Eyewitness testimonies described Allied prisoners in Nazi hands forced into lice-infested barracks, beaten for requesting water, and left without sanitation until typhus spread. Soviet camps were worse. Millions perished from starvation, exposure, and untreated disease. Against that backdrop, the American insistence on bathing routines and medical checks seemed almost surreal. Some German officers resented it. They muttered that being told to scrub like schoolboys was a deliberate humiliation. Others quietly admitted relief. A corporal later recalled in testimony, "I was angry at first. Then I slept one night without lice biting. It was the first peace I had known in years." The policy had another purpose. Interrogators noted that cleaner, healthier prisoners were easier to question. Men stripped of filth and disease were more likely to talk, to drop the rigid masks of defiance. A diary found later in one camp recorded, "The soap is a weapon sharper than the whip. It breaks us slowly, making us see we are men again, not warriors." Still, order could not mask despair. The food was meager, the wire unyielding. Nights were restless, filled with the sound of coughing, muttered prayers, and the hum of generators beyond the fence. Yet the smallest routines carried weight. Clean hands, washed faces, the faint scent of soap clinging to skin even as hunger gnawed at bellies. By autumn, the prisoners began to understand. The Americans were not granting luxuries. They were upholding rules written years earlier in Geneva, rules their own regime had often ignored. That realization stung more than punishment. It forced the captives to confront the gulf between the Reich they had served and the law their enemies had honored. As dusk fell on the camp at Heilbronn, shadows lengthened across the wire. Floodlights snapped on, humming against the rain. Inside, men lay on the sodden ground, their bodies aching, their stomachs empty. But their skin was clean, and the faint smell of soap lingered in the air. The war was finished. Yet in the discipline of captivity, the echoes of Geneva raised a question that would haunt them long after release. Had they lost to armies, or to an idea stronger than force? The train platforms were crowded with men in ill-fitting civilian clothes. They carried paper bags, small bundles, or nothing at all. Released prisoners of war stepped down onto German soil, their eyes scanning ruins that had once been their neighborhoods. Families embraced them, hesitant at first, as if unsure who had truly returned. Yet in letters, diaries, and later memoirs, one memory kept surfacing, not of rations, not of interrogations, but of soap. For many veterans, the war had stripped life of all normal comforts. Mud, lice, and filth had become second skins from the Eastern Front to the final retreat into Germany. Cleanliness was a memory, not a reality. When the Americans handed out soap in the camps and demanded regular washing, it etched itself into the minds of the defeated. Years later, men still describe the smell of lye, the sting of water on raw skin, and the startling sense of dignity it restored. A former Wehrmacht officer, writing in 1953, recalled, "I had nothing left, not my command, not my country, not even my pride. Then I was told to wash. I looked down at my hands after scrubbing and realized I was still human. It was unbearable and comforting at the same time." His words reflected what countless others admitted in private, that the soap mattered more than the bread. Many hooks emerged in testimonies. Some veterans confessed that the memory haunted them more than hunger. One said the soap smelled like another world, one we had destroyed and could not re-enter. Another wrote bitterly that it was a reminder of what the Reich had denied its enemies: dignity in defeat. The Americans had given them what their own regime had taken from others. Historians studying these accounts note how disproportionate the memory seems. Not rations, not shelter, but soap. The explanation lies in contrast. Where men expected cruelty, they received order. Where they expected humiliation, they received hygiene. The smallest act became magnified, seared into memory precisely because it overturned fear. The effect lasted long after captivity ended. In post-war Germany, former prisoners told their children about the bars of soap, describing them with more vividness than battles. Some veterans kept scraps of the wrappers, hidden in drawers like relics. Others never touched soap again without recalling the camp troughs, the smell of wet earth underfoot, the floodlights humming overhead. According to one American Guard's letter, "We thought little of it. Soap was regulation, nothing more. But I'll never forget how those men stared at it, as if we'd given them gold." What was ordinary for the guards became extraordinary for the captives, and it stuck with them in ways no one had expected. As the years passed, memoirs piled up, and the detail returned again and again. Soap, the gift that was not meant as a gift, but as policy, lingered longer than interrogations or the fences of wire. It was a reminder that even in defeat, there could be glimpses of humanity, haunting precisely because they were unexpected. On the platform at Bremen, a veteran bent to tie his shoe. His fingers brushed against a bar of soap tucked inside his bag, wrapped in brown paper. He had carried it all the way from the camp, unused. The train hissed behind him. The ruins of his city stretched ahead, and the faint scent of lye clung to the air like a memory that refused to fade.